Okay, excellent. So I'm delighted to be here. Let me start with a brief apology. I mentioned that a couple of minutes ago, but I'm starting teaching today, so I'm going to be around for the first session, but then I'm going to, regrettably, I'm going to have to step away, and I'll try to come back later. So I'm going to briefly talk about global value chains in the age of turmoil. So let me just give you a roadmap. This is a short presentation, so let me just tell you what I think I can at least try to accomplish in this short amount of time. So I'm going to start by reviewing recent trends in the global economy. And in particular, I'm going to try to answer the following questions, or provide answers to the following questions, which is: first, have we entered a phase of deglobalization like some analysts or some commentators have been writing about? And second, if so, is it because global value chains are retrenching? So I'm going to review this, and then I'm going to try to speculate more on the future of globalization and of global value chains in the face of recent geopolitical tensions. And then I'll let Richard take over and give his own view on this potential future for global value chains. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to very basically structure my presentation around 6 points. So it's basically 6 slides. Obviously, there's things that I could expand on maybe later in the discussion, but I thought it'd be important to focus. So the first point that I'm going to make is that although there's been a lot of talk about deglobalization, I'm yet not convinced that if there has to be or if there is to be a deglobalization, this is something that's already happening. So why are people talking about deglobalization? Largely, if you've seen this figure that's plotting a very standard measure of trade integration, which is the ratio of world trade over world GDP, you see that since the great financial crisis, this is a series that seems to be on the decline. It seems to, you can sort of try to spot a declining trend in that series. Obviously, it's very early, so it's hard to tell, you wouldn't get much statistical power if you try to kind of fit something negatively sloped here. But in any case, it's been demonstrated that to a large extent, the reason why we see that is because of China, and not because of China deglobalizing or because of the recent trade conflicts with the US. This is something that very much precedes that trade war. Simply, it's driven by the fact that China has been moving up the value chain. It's been doing more and more of the stages upstream from assembly. And that naturally, if you take a measure of globalization, this ratio of world trade over world GDP, that's actually going to put downward pressure on that series. So if you use this measure to claim there's deglobalization, I don't think that's sort of tenable, because it seems to be driven by the success of China in sort of gaining comparative advantage in relatively more upstream stages of production. Now, building on this point one, what I would argue is that if one wants to kind of think about the future of globalization in light of this figure that I'm showing you here on the left panel, it may be more productive to think about the prior period, because this is really what's extraordinary here. You have a series, which is the world trade over world GDP, which in any sort of post model, this would be a series that you'd expect to be stationary, that you'd expect it might grow and go down, up and down, but in the long run, it should basically be fairly stable. And instead, what you've seen, what we saw in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s was the remarkable growth of globalization. So I think it's more productive to first go back to what happened there, and I'm going to do that very quickly, and then try to see whether the forces that drove that period, whether these are forces that can that maybe have been stalling, and that might why we see slowbalization rather than deglobalization, and more importantly, whether these forces might actually start working in reverse. So the same way that they led to a process of hyperglobalization, they might actually lead to a true process of deglobalization. So to think about that, let's just sort of break up the drivers of that hyperglobalization period into 3 main building blocks. One is technology. And here I have in mind basically the ICT revolution, which basically allowed, as Richard has written extensively, allowed for a fragmentation of production across borders and better communication at very long distances. This was coupled with policy improvements trade liberalization through multilateral rounds at the WTO, but more importantly, through regional trade agreements. If you think about NAFTA, Mercosur, the expansion of the European Union, ASEAN FTA, all this is happening in the late 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. So that basically, the same time that people could communicate better at long distances, the flow of goods became cheaper as well. And third is simply politics, which is at the same time that this technology and policies were increasing the demand for foreign labor from the point of view of firms in the West, there's a massive labor supply shock. China enters the capitalist system, Eastern Europe enters the capitalist system. So the combination of these forces basically led to a very remarkable disintegration of production processes, which has been documented in a variety of ways, but that in the last slide I showed you as an increase in that measure of globalization. So the key question is, okay, we have technology, we have policy, politics. Why has globalization stopped growing? Why around 2007, 2008? And more importantly, could these forces actually go in reverse? So let's start with technology. And on the technology front, I'm actually, and I'm eager to hear what Richard has to say, but I'm actually pretty optimistic. In my view, technology, technological developments in the next decade or two are going to continue to foster trade. First, why do I base that on? I base that on a combination of conceptual aspects and empirics. Conceptually, over history, there's very few forms of technical progress that have actually been negatively impact globalization, and certainly the ICT revolution was a big boost to the growth of globalization. Why are some people more pessimistic? Well, they talk about new technologies being different. You got automation, industrial robots, 3D printing. Those are things that seem to be very close substitutes for foreign labor. So you'd say, well, if low wages were the big fuel to fragmentation, if we now can do this thing with robots, I mean, what's the point of fragmenting anymore? Then there's other technologies that are rising and being more and more important. Obviously, digital platforms, digital technologies more broadly, blockchain, this open distributed ledgers that appear to reduce the transaction cost of conducting business internationally. I think there's less debate here. I think everybody agrees that these two are likely to be positive for trade, but there's a lot of debate about automation. In my own view, again, based on conceptual aspects, but also based on evidence, is that automation is actually not likely to be deglobalizing, at least in the next couple of decades. And the reason for that is basically the following one, which is, if you think about what automation is doing at this point in time, think about automakers, for instance. This is largely assembly. Okay, there's a very limited set of things that robots can do at this point in time. Certainly, robots are going to be replacing, substituting for floor factory workers that were doing that assembly before. But these robots, they're not producing stuff out of thin air. They need inputs, they need materials, so on and so forth. So to the extent that these inputs, these materials continue to be produced worldwide, and to the extent that automation essentially increases productivity at the plant level, which, there's a lot of evidence for that, this is basically a shock that's going to tend to increase the demand for intermediate inputs. And because world trade is to a large extent trade in intermediate inputs, about 2/3 of world trade is in intermediate inputs, I just don't see that that's actually going to, at least as long as robots are doing what they're doing now, and they don't start doing many more things, this is not going to be deglobalizing. This is not just theoretical predictions. Empirical work has documented, on the one hand, folks that have looked at how plants react to automation, they see that they increase their imports. They're not decreasing their imports when they automate, okay? Second, if you look at, more broadly, the technology aspects of production, if you look at big episodes like the trade collapse on 0809, if you look at the more recent pandemic, there's been a very fast recovery of trade flows, and that has a lot to do with the fact that global value chains are very sticky. Even in the face of changes in relative prices, because setting up those global value chains entail very high fixed costs that were very much sunk in nature, there's this stickiness. So it's going to take much more than what we're seeing now to actually dismantle these global value chains. And that's purely a point based on technology, technological improvements, but also on how the technology of global value chains. The fourth point I want to make is briefly touch on COVID. And I think that's a bit maybe outdated. I think that's what I'm going to say is a bit less controversial now than when I first started making that prediction in late 2020, which is COVID is a remarkably large shock and a very devastating one. But when it comes to the global economy, it created very large distortions early on. But if you look at patterns of world trade, they've recovered very quickly. It's clear that the dust has not settled yet. There's still a lot of talk about supply chain disruptions that's fueled inflation, so on and so forth. But if you look at aggregate measures, we're basically where we were before the pandemic. So this idea that the pandemic is going to generate this new environment where people are going to be reluctant to travel or reluctant to conduct business at long distances, that's frankly something that I don't necessarily buy. I'm not saying that COVID will not leave scars that might come back to matter for the future of globalization, as I'll say in a second, but I don't think it's the pandemic per se. The fifth point is about protectionism. Okay, so technology, I'm not too worried. The pandemic, I'm not too worried. What about policy? And here, obviously, there's more signs of concern. Why? Because we've seen in the last 10 years or so, many signs of increasing protectionism. The WTO is basically dead. I mean, there's not much going on there. Regional trade liberalization has stalled, and it's even worse. It's starting to work in reverse. Brexit is an example of that. The USMCA, the new NAFTA, is sort of a lighter version of NAFTA. So we seem to be deliberalizing rather than further liberalizing. And obviously, the big elephant in the room is the recent US-China trade tensions. Okay, so there's lots of concerns about protectionism. Again, we could say, well, that sort of indicates that protection is going to be on the rise. You could make that prediction, but you need to understand where it's coming from, right? I mean, it's very easy to say, well, this third point is the fact that we had a president in the US that was idiosyncratic, and he just wanted to fight China. Or you could say Brexit, it's sort of some weird decision of someone that called a referendum, but there's nothing underlying. I don't buy that. I mean, and it's not just me. There's a lot of growing evidence that suggests that there's some underlying forces that led the US to elect President Trump, that led other politicians to go on anti-globalization platforms. And there's obviously many drivers of that demand for protectionism, but I think a leading one is the growth of inequality. The fact that if you look at this period of hyperglobalization, we witnessed both very fast increases in trade openness, very fast increases in income. There's no doubt that, for instance, the process of trade liberalization lifted millions and millions of individuals out of poverty in countries like China. But at the same time, if you look at just about any measure of income inequality, those measures increased a lot. And not only that, but there's a sense that there was a non-trivial fraction of the population of many countries that actually did not gain much from globalization and actually perceived that they lost. Maybe they lost their job, their real income went down. So that basically led to a growing sense of alienation that fostered the popularity of certain politicians that said, you know, this was all China's fault and we're going to put an end to this. So I think that's very important, because if there is to be deglobalization, again, just to kind of recap and sort of start concluding, I don't think it's going to be coming from the technology front. I don't think it's going to be coming from the pandemic, but it might be coming from policy and from politics. And to a large extent, if that's coming from policy and from politics, it will be coming from the fact that their inequality is growing, has grown, and will continue to grow, and governments might not be doing enough to appease the growing alienation that is following from that. So just to recap, and I know it's sort of fast, but I mean, that there's a time constraint. The 6 points I try to make is, first, globalization, I don't think it's run its course. If anything, there's slowbalization, but that's what you would expect anyway. Hyperglobalization was not sustainable. Indeed, that's my point too, which is that globalization was really the extraordinary period. Third, technology will continue to foster trade and GVCs, at least in the next 2 to 3 decades. I don't think COVID per se is something that will be deglobalizing, but it might be indirectly, to the extent that it fosters, it sort of aggravates growing inequalities. And there's a lot of evidence that COVID is a very unequalizing shock, to the extent that that continues to foster growing demand for protectionism. I think that's really where the perils for deglobalization phase are. And I'll stop here because I'm out of time. Thank you.